A narrow road cuts through pine forests, curves around dark lakes, and disappears between fields partially covered in snow. On the horizon, a wooden house emerges, painted a deep, almost earthy red. Then another appears, and another. All of them have pale window trim, dark roofs, and facades that seem to have belonged to that landscape forever. You might think these houses are red, because Scandinavians have always liked the color. They are not. The red that now represents rural simplicity began, in part, as an attempt to look wealthy. For centuries, red brick buildings were associated with churches, palaces, cities, and prestigious estates. Those who could not afford to build with brick found a way to imitate its appearance. They painted the wood. But that imitation only became a tradition because one mind supplied the ingredient that made it affordable, practical, and durable. To understand why a farmhouse would try to look like a palace, we need to return to a time when painting an entire facade was already a display of wealth. Long before red came to dominate the Swedish countryside, Scandinavian houses were born from the forest. Pines and spruces grew in abundance. The trees were felled, stripped of their bark, and carried to the building site. Craftsmen cut interlocking notches into the ends and stacked the logs horizontally. The weight of the wall itself held the structure together. Between the logs, moss, plant fibers, and other local materials sealed the gaps where wind could enter. Above the walls were roofs made from wood, thatch, or sod. In some regions, the vegetation layer helped protect the structure and reduce temperature fluctuations. Windows were small because glass was expensive, and every opening created another place where heat could escape. Inside, daylight was limited. Smoke from the fire darkened the surfaces. Outside, snow accumulated on the roof. Rain struck the walls, and moisture lingered for long periods. Wood was the logical choice. It was readily available. It could be worked with relatively simple tools. It provided good thermal performance when the walls were properly built. A damaged piece could be replaced without tearing down the entire house. Families and communities could erect buildings using knowledge passed down through generations. But exposed wood ages. Water penetrates ends and joints. Solar radiation breaks down the surface fibers. Fungi find favorable conditions wherever moisture lingers. The facade loses its original color and darkens unevenly. Many houses remained unpainted. Others were treated with tar, oils, lime, or mixtures made from materials available in the region. There was no single solution for all of Northern Europe. Painting an entire house required raw materials, labor, and maintenance. That meant a colored facade was not merely a protected surface. It also communicated that the owner could spend resources on something beyond the essential structure. Before becoming protection, color began functioning as a social language. The 16th and 17th centuries. In cities, administrative centers, and elite estates, red brick gained prestige. It appeared in churches, fortifications, noble residences, and buildings associated with power. Compared with a wall of weathered logs, brick conveyed a very different message. It looked permanent, urban, modern. It was also expensive. Scandinavia possessed vast reserves of timber, but brick construction depended on a far more complex supply chain. Suitable clay had to be found, shaped, dried, and fired in fuel-fed kilns under controlled conditions. Thousands of individual bricks then had to be transported to the construction site. Skilled masons were required to organize the walls and openings. Every stage consumed fuel, labor, and time. For most farmers, replacing a wooden house with a brick residence was far beyond reach. The solution appeared on the surface. The structure remained built from logs or boards. The facade, however, received a red pigment. From a distance, the building approached the color of the masonry structures valued by the elite. The imitation did not need to deceive anyone standing directly in front of the wall. The lines of the wood remained visible. Its texture did not magically become ceramic. The purpose was to communicate association. The facade was saying, "This property follows the architecture of the wealthy." On some estates, only the main house received color. Barns, storehouses, stables, and secondary structures remained natural wood. Painting everything would have been too expensive. The contrast between buildings also helped identify which one held the most important position. That is the first great irony. The color that now symbolizes rusticity began as an attempt to escape rusticity, at least visually. What appears humble today initially sought to resemble the language of palaces, churches, and urban homes. But red did not yet dominate the countryside. For that to happen, it needed to become more than desirable. It needed to become affordable. The decisive ingredient did not emerge from an artist's studio. It emerged from the waste of a mine. The story changes direction in Falun, in the Dalarna region of central Sweden. There, the landscape was shaped by copper extraction. Tunnels advanced through the rock. Wooden structures supported passageways and equipment. Workers broke apart, separated, and transported material. Furnaces and processing facilities released smoke across the area. Around the operation, enormous volumes of rock and mineral waste accumulated in the open air. The Falun mine was not a peripheral operation. For centuries, it profoundly influenced the Swedish economy. During the 17th century, when Sweden became a major power in European copper production, Falun occupied a strategic position. The wealth extracted from underground helped finance trade, technology, and political power. But not everything removed from the mountain was usable copper. Piles of material remained exposed to rain, air, and changing temperatures. Over time, oxidation transformed the compounds within this waste. Iron-rich materials developed colors ranging from yellow and ochre to various reddish shades. This material could be selected, washed, dried, heated, and finally ground into powder. The result was a mineral pigment. Iron oxides produced the earthy red that would become so recognizable on Swedish facades. The tradition associated with this pigment became known as Falu rödfärg, an expression connected to Falun red paint. The specific product is associated with mineral material originating from the mine. Although other flower paints and red pigments were also used in Sweden, Finland, and neighboring regions, not every red house was painted with Falun pigment. Formulas varied according to the period, region, and manufacturer. In general, a traditional preparation combined mineral pigment, water, and rye flour, or another starch that acted as a binder. Some recipes incorporated linseed oil. Other ingredients could appear depending on the formulation. The mixture did not produce the smooth, glossy surface created by many modern industrial paints. The finish was matte, almost velvety. The wood continued to reveal its grain, saw marks, and small irregularities. The temperature used to process the pigment also influenced its shade. Variations in calcination, the controlled heating of the mineral material, produced lighter reds, darker reds, or colors approaching brown. Mining waste became an architectural resource. Material that had once formed piles around a copper operation began covering houses, workshops, and barns. But the pigment did not spread only because its color resembled brick. It spread because it worked particularly well with wood. A wooden wall may look rigid, but it is never completely still. Wood absorbs moisture from the environment and releases it again. Its fibers expand and contract slightly with the seasons, temperature, and amount of water in the air. You can imagine it as a rigid sponge. It does not behave like wet fabric, but it continuously exchanges moisture with its surroundings. When the air is humid, the wood absorbs some of that moisture. When conditions become drier, it releases some of it. This movement changes its dimensions, opens small cracks, and places pressure on any finish applied to the surface. Problems emerge when an excessively sealed layer tries to prevent all that exchange. Imagine water entering through a crack, a joint, or an inadequately protected end. If the coating makes it difficult for that moisture to escape, it can remain trapped behind the film. Over time, this encourages blistering, peeling, and deterioration of the wood. In the most vulnerable areas, lingering moisture creates conditions for decay. Traditional mineral flower paints do not necessarily form a thick, waterproof plastic film. The coating remains more porous and better follows the texture of a suitable surface, particularly rough, unplaned wood. The facade can still release some moisture. In simple terms, the paint protects the surface without trying to turn wood into plastic. That does not mean it creates a perfect barrier. Rain must still be managed through the design of the building. The finish reduces direct exposure and helps the wood age more evenly. The pigment also reduces the direct impact of solar radiation on the surface fibers. Without protection, sunlight degrades components in the wood and leaves the outer layer more fragile. By covering that surface, the paint absorbs part of the wear that would otherwise strike the facade directly. But no color can save a poorly constructed building. If the boards extend too close to the ground, they receive splashback and remain damp. If the roof lacks adequate eaves, more water reaches the walls. If a gutter breaks, rain is repeatedly concentrated in the same area. If joints and ends remain exposed, moisture finds pathways inside. The house still depends on drainage, ventilation, maintenance, and the replacement of damaged components. The finish participates in the system. It does not replace the system. The way the paint ages also helps explain some of its cultural longevity. Under appropriate conditions, certain traditional formulations gradually become powdery. As the binder wears away, a small amount of pigment comes loose as dust on the surface. Before applying a new coat, careful brushing may be enough to remove dirt and loose material. It is not always necessary to strip away multiple complete layers. The procedure depends on the condition of the facade, the composition previously used, and the type of wood. A modern film-forming paint creates an adhered, relatively continuous layer. Traditional flower paint visually integrates with the roughness of the wood. One can peel away in sheets when it loses adhesion. The other may wear away more gradually. This is not an absolute rule, but it reveals two different protection strategies. Economics completes the equation. The mixture uses relatively accessible raw materials. It can be applied over sawn wood without an extremely refined finish. Large barn walls do not need to be sanded until perfectly smooth. Maintenance can be performed without rebuilding the entire surface, and this is where two modern myths begin to lose their strength. Red was not developed primarily to warm the house. A dark surface may absorb more solar radiation than a light one, but its effect on indoor temperature is limited compared with wall thickness, insulation, windows, air leakage, and the heating system. Nor was it created simply so houses could be found in the snow. The contrast exists and makes the buildings more visible. But that does not explain why red became connected to brick, mining, and shifting social classes. Red survived because it combined three advantages that rarely appear together: status, price, and performance. Then one of those advantages changed meaning entirely. The 18th and 19th centuries. Production became more organized. Red pigment and the paints associated with it reached a growing number of property owners. What had once helped distinguish important buildings began covering ordinary rural houses, storehouses, stables, and barns. A symbol of wealth became a popular solution. As more people gained access to red, the elite searched for new ways to distinguish themselves. Main residences began appearing in white, yellow, and other pale shades. Certain finishes required more expensive pigments, better prepared surfaces, and careful maintenance. The social logic was simple. Once everyone could copy a symbol of prestige, the wealthy changed the symbol. Red lost some of its exclusivity, and precisely because it lost that exclusivity, it conquered the countryside. Large estates began using color to visually organize their buildings. The main residence might appear in yellow or white, while barns and outbuildings remained red. Doors, windows, and trim boards received pale details. Dark roofs completed the contrast. Barns were ideal candidates for this coating. They had large wooden surfaces exposed to the weather. They needed economical protection. They did not require the delicate finish of an urban residence. A matte, affordable paint compatible with rough wood solved the problem without completely concealing the material. This also demonstrates why a color never has a fixed social meaning. First, red brought a wooden house closer to prestigious brick architecture. Then it became an affordable finish for farmers. Later, it came to represent the memory of the countryside itself. Industrialization seemed destined to end this story. New pigments, resins, and manufacturing processes offered a broader range of colors and different coatings. The old mineral paint could have disappeared like so many other artisanal solutions. But the opposite happened. The more modernity transformed the cities, the more the red house came to represent everything that seemed to be disappearing. Between the late 19th and 20th centuries, the architectural palette expanded dramatically. White, yellow, green, blue, gray, black, and different shades of red became more accessible. The color of a facade no longer depended solely on pigments found near the construction site. At that moment, red stopped being inevitable. It became a choice. Architects, artists, writers, and cultural movements turned their attention toward vernacular architecture, the buildings created from local materials, techniques, and traditions. The rural house no longer appeared merely backward. It came to be seen as a record of a particular way of life. Paintings, photographs, postcards, calendars, children's books, and advertisements repeated the same image. A red house, white details, a forest in the background, a lake nearby. In summer, the facade contrasted with the green landscape. In winter, it stood out against the snow. Red came to signify childhood, stability, countryside, belonging, and continuity. What began as an imitation of another form of architecture acquired an identity of its own. The red house became especially powerful as a visual symbol of Sweden. It also appeared prominently in parts of Finland, where red flower paints and ochre pigments became part of rural traditions. Its influence reached the landscapes of other Nordic countries, but it did not create uniformity. In its more restricted geographical and cultural sense, Scandinavia generally refers to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. The Nordic countries form a broader category that also includes Finland and Iceland. Their architecture is not identical. In Norway, white, yellow, ochre, and other colors occupy an important place on wooden houses. In Denmark, brick buildings and pale facades have a strong presence. In Iceland, colorful metal cladding became a recognizable response to the climate and the availability of materials. Even within Sweden and Finland, houses can be green, blue, yellow, white, or black. The phrase "red Scandinavian houses" describes a real but generalized image. It is not an architectural rule for the entire region, and that distinction makes the third twist even more interesting. Modernization did not eliminate red. It transformed a historical necessity into a cultural identity. Today, a red house can look old, even when almost nothing behind the facade belongs to the past. Behind the exterior boards may be a timber frame manufactured with industrial precision. Next comes a thick layer of mineral or plant-based thermal insulation. A barrier controls the movement of vapor from the interior. A wind-resistant membrane reduces air leakage. A ventilated cavity creates room for moisture to escape before reaching the interior layers. The windows may have double or triple glazing. Heat pumps extract energy from the air or ground. Mechanical ventilation refreshes the interior while recovering some of the heat. Solar panels power equipment. Sensors monitor temperature, humidity, and air quality. It looks traditional. It is not. The color belongs to historical memory. The performance belongs to contemporary engineering. Not every red facade today uses the traditional preparation. Some receive modern paints formulated to reproduce the historic appearance. Others use products directly connected to the Falu Rødfarge tradition, applied over compatible surfaces. Still others use red paints made with industrial pigments containing no material from Phelan at all. In historic areas, municipal regulations, conservation guidelines, or heritage associations may restrict colors and materials. Elsewhere, owners are free to choose red. The decision continues to make sense for several reasons. The color integrates with the rural landscape. It maintains continuity with neighboring buildings. Certain traditional systems offer relatively simple maintenance when applied correctly. Above all, red makes it possible to build something new without visually breaking from the place around it. A house can be designed with software, cut by computer-controlled machinery, and assembled from industrial components. It may consume only a fraction of the energy required by an old residence. Even so, it receives a color connected to mineral waste accumulated centuries ago. That contrast reveals the true power of tradition. The houses are not red merely to remain visible in the snow. The contrast helps, but it does not explain their origin. Nor are they red primarily to absorb heat. Insulation, air sealing, windows, and heating systems have a much greater influence on indoor comfort. Not every Scandinavian house is red. Each country, region, and historical period developed its own combinations of materials and colors. The paint is not merely decoration either. In many cases, the finish reduces the wood's direct exposure and participates in moisture management. It cannot completely prevent fungi, insects, or decay. A neglected facade remains vulnerable. And red has not always symbolized simplicity. That is the greatest irony in the entire story. The color began partly as an imitation of more expensive architecture. When it became affordable, it lost prestige and moved on to barns. When industrialization offered thousands of alternatives, it returned as a symbol of authenticity. The answer, then, is not a single cause. It is a sequence: imitation, availability, protection, economy, industrialization, identity. We return to the same road. The forest remains silent. The lake reflects a pale sky. Snow covers the edges of the field. In the distance, a red house emerges among the pines. Now its facade looks different. It preserves the memory of a society in which brick represented wealth and wood represented rural life. It carries the residue of a mining industry that shaped the Swedish economy. It reveals knowledge about pigments, moisture, and aging. It shows how farmers adapted affordable materials to the needs of large wooden buildings. Red began by trying to imitate brick. Then it found an abundant raw material in mineral waste. It protected houses and barns. It spread as it lost exclusivity. It survived industrialization. Finally, it became one of the most recognizable images of Northern Europe. None of these stages explains everything on its own. Together, they transformed a color into visual heritage. The Red House began by trying to look like something else, Centuries later, it became impossible to mistake it for anything else. And that leaves one final question. How many features we now call tradition began merely as inexpensive solutions, imitations of wealth, or accidents of material, and remained long enough to become the identity of an entire people? If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you can follow the next stories. See you next time!